Hi there, and welcome back to Cyburst, a podcast all about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We're your hosts, Isabel
and Ella, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds, steering this spaceship into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode, heroes and villains in comics and their adaptations. We want to know, what does the presentation of science and technology say about the heroics or villainy of comic characters?
And as always, we're going to start by jumping into some recommendations. But before we do that, it's really important that we acknowledge this episode of Cyburst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Indigenous Australians are the first scientists and first artists, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and future.
So here we go with a culture snap, getting us started. Isabel, what's your culture snap for us today?
Yes, actually, my one is something Ella introduced me to recently. It is called the Wiki game or the Wikipedia game, and you basically start on a random Wikipedia page, and the goal is to get to another Wikipedia page with as few clicks as possible. So, we did this at work
with our manager.
She loved it too. Where we tried to get from the from the Australian Overland Telegraph Line page to the cybernetics page, and we all competed against each other to see who could get there with the least amount of clicks. And by clicks, it means clicking on other links to other Wikipedia pages within the page.
Yeah, the embedded hyperlinks.
Yes, yeah.
And it was really interesting because we all took very different paths, and I think two of us managed to get there in the same amount of clicks. And some of us kind of got stuck in little feedback loops.
Yeah, because as soon as you make a decision to click on something, you can't press the back button. So you can get stuck somewhere. Super fun, free to play. Also, really good way of making connections between things, and it really helps you realize where your knowledge gaps are too, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way to ground your understanding of a topic by seeing how well you think you can get there through related topics. So I actually think it was perfect for cybernetics, all about systematic thinking.
Yeah, and making connections between things. So yeah, great fun. Highly recommend. But what's your culture snap, Ella?
My culture snap today, so this is our October episode.
Oh my God, it is.
Maybe you've got some spookiness to get up to, some spooky parties. Maybe you have a costume party coming up, who knows? My recommendation though is, if you have any of these events, and if not, maybe create your own, is wearing a pun-related costume. I think the next level of costume parties is when you put like the actual thought, not into necessarily the costume, but why. So I think the puns are really fun. I think duo costumes are really fun, group costumes. So I highly encourage you, if you're going to one, come up with a fun pun-related costume and have the best time making as many references to that as possible in the upcoming days and at the party and afterwards.
Have you done a pun-related costume for Halloween before?
That is a really good question. I think I've done like pun-related ones. Oh, I went as, there was like a magical theme once, and I went as fairy bread.
That's excellent.
So I went with fairy wings.
Oh, that's so fun.
And a wooden spoon as a wand, and little, the colourful book tabs. I had them all over my white t-shirt as sprinkles.
Oh, that's perfect.
And it was super Australian as well.
Oh my gosh. I love that.
And then it's just so fun because you get to recall it, and it's just like oh, what'd you go as? I went as Spider-Man. Cool, but cooler if you get like a cool, unique spin on it that is fun to you and cool to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to have a costume that's a conversation starter for sure.
Speaking of conversation starters, Spider-Man? I feel like he's a recognizable character. From some comics.
From comics, did you say?
I said comics. Isabel, what are we talking about today?
So our topic, we're going to be diving into, like Ella said, science in comics and what science makes a hero versus what science related topics makes a villain. Because science, technology, and science narratives are very common in superhero comics.
Super duper common.
Mm-hmm. And that's from both the hero and villain side. And especially in the two big franchises of Marvel and DC.
Yeah.
And DC will be particularly focusing on today.
Because
we're actually launching this episode as part of a National Film and Sound Archive film night.
A science and film night.
Yes.
So cool.
And the Science and Film Night is based on the 1997 film adaptation Batman and Robin.
My most beloved Batman film.
That is the George Clooney one. Yes, that is probably the one that you hate, but it is fun to watch. It is so camp.
It's just a great time all around.
Yes. So we're actually guest
panelists.
Thank you, Anna Sophie, for inviting us. So that's also going to mean we're going to be focusing a lot on Batman characters, both heroes and villains.
But don't worry, if you're going to that event, we are going to spice it up. It's not going to be an exact repeat of this episode. They're going to kind of complement each other.
Yes, yeah. Like what we did for our Uncharted Territory episode, actually.
Yeah, the one on street art. That was so much fun.
So there are many popular, famous superheroes and supervillains who are or were scientists.
Yeah.
And have science as a core part of their origin stories. And with superheroes, the science and science narrative tends to be a little more vague. And the science is, of course, used for good.
Because they're the heroes.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Whereas for supervillains, interestingly, the science seems to be explained a lot more and the technology explained a lot more. Lots of mad scientist tropes. Sometimes they start with good intentions. For instance, they want to cure a loved one of a terminal disease.
Is that a reference to Mr. Freeze from the 1997 Batman and Robin film? Crazy.
We might get into that a bit later. But then they start with good intentions, but then the characters get angry with the world and lose patience and everything goes to the extreme and the world suffers from it.
Not good.
No.
Sounds a bit villainous.
So there are also a lot of superheroes where they're born with the powers through being part of a superhuman or demigod or alien race. So that's characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, Thor.
So kind of still within the science fiction genre, but normally kind of like alien space, not as scientifically explained as a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, exactly. And also all of the superheroes and supervillains have many different origin stories and adaptations. We're going to be focusing on the more sciencey related ones.
Yeah, but I guess kind of hopping back to one of our really, really early episodes on multiverses, comic books are rife with multiversal stories.
Yeah.
Intersecting or not intersecting, characters being in different versions of themselves.
Different writers.
Yeah, comic books are absolutely rife with that. So, of course, we can't cover all of that. But it is really interesting that across those, most characters have a science-related story at least one place or another.
Yeah, definitely. And through our little investigations, Ella and I found a few different formulas or categories related to science and the making of a villain or the making of a hero. The first one, and this might be my favorite one, actually.
I was really proud of spotting these similarities when we were talking about the topic.
Yeah, for sure, is to do with scientific research funding cuts or rejection of your scientific project.
So interesting.
So interesting.
Tell me more, Isabel.
This might hit a little too close to home for some of our listeners and as someone who also knows what it's like to get your paper rejected, your research rejected. Not an easy thing.
Soul crushing. But Isabel, as of yet, and my awareness, hasn't become a villain.
No, I'm fine. If anything, I'm becoming a superhero.
Some characters, however, don't take it very well.
Yeah. So interesting. This theme is something we see predominantly for the making of villains.
Yeah, absolutely.
And not in hero arcs, at least for a reason for them becoming a superhero.
Yeah, it's normally in the backstory of a villain, whereas I think if it ever happens with a superhero, it kind of bounces off them and isn't as an integral plot point.
So I am going to start with a Batman example, Poison Ivy, or Dr. Pamela Isley, who was a botanist in the 1997 Batman and Robin movie. So that's the one we'll be guest panelists for. She has funding cut from her lab because her lab boss is unethical.
Super unethical.
He's also problematic. He's the guy who also creates another Batman villain, Bane, who we'll talk about a little later too. But Wayne Enterprises, who was sponsoring the lab, continues to sponsor other environmental protection work, which is what her work was on. And so she gets upset by that, can't see this good, and becomes a villain.
Which is crazy because it's kind of explained that Wayne Enterprises stopped funding that because her boss was unethical, and that's something that this character understands and agrees with because she kills him.
Yes. Yeah, that's a whole other thing too. I have other things to say about Poison Ivy in a different category. The other thing was that in the movie, there's a scene where Bruce Wayne, or Batman, explains that he admires Poison Ivy's intentions, but realizes that the action she wanted to take to achieve the environmental protection would cause millions of people to die of cold and hunger alone. So he was basically like, nope, people come first. I am not going to give you the money.
Which seems super reasonable.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time, like, these backstories are supposed to like help us as an audience to understand and empathize with the villain and see them as more human. But this very reasonable explanation as to why he couldn't support her proposal. Maybe she should have just been like, yep, understand, makes sense. Can I work for them?
Yeah, definitely a bit of an overreaction on her part.
Villainy at its finest.
A similar example, also a Batman villain, the Riddler, or Edward Nygma. So there's another Batman adaptation, Batman Forever. And in that movie, Jim Carrey plays
the Riddler.
And in that depiction, he also works for Wayne Enterprises as a researcher and is rejected by his idol, who is Batman, for one of his inventions. And it's this device that is designed to beam television directly into a person's brain. Funky, strange. And so Batman rejects it because he thinks it's mind manipulation and getting too dangerous and raises too many questions. So he goes, no, maybe let's not do that.
Seems super ethical to me.
Yes. But then, of course, the Riddler is like, I don't like that, so turns to crime and, interestingly, uses his scientific knowledge for evil, instead becoming a crazed villain and marking his crimes with riddles.
I love no, I don't agree with your perspective, therefore I'm going to commit crime.
Yeah, which is the case for many villains, apparently. So in these comic universes, funding being pulled and rejection equals direct hatred funneling, and scientist becomes evil. This is not what happens in real life. I want to clarify that, because rejection is such a unfortunately common thing, and research funding being pulled is also such an unfortunately common thing, but this is not how scientists react. Fascinating that in comic universes, they've decided to make this the reason that scientists become villains.
Yeah, so I guess we do only see that trope as related to villains, which is really interesting because our next category applies to both, and also an in-between question.
Yeah.
This collection of heroes, villains, and question mark is about superhero serum,
Mm.
which I thought there was going to be a large body of works on. And I did an academic search of it, and there are only 2 peer-reviewed topics that even touch on this. One of them has 2 sentences.
Yeah, you think why? Why hasn't that been written about more? Anyway,
catch our paper coming whenever we have time. I think the first and most obvious example of the superhero serum is Steve Rogers / Captain America.
Yeah.
I think there are some interesting things here. We know that Steve Rogers volunteered to be injected. We know he wasn't super gifted before this, but we do know he had very good morals.
Mm-hmm. So, I think it's important to highlight that he volunteered
Yes.
for it.
He consented.
There was consent.
He mostly knew what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think he believed that it was going to work, but I think he was excited for it, knew it was going to happen.
He becomes a superhero.
And the organization that does that generally has good intentions. So there we have a hero. Another superhero serum we can see also within the MCU is by the Hulk. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the Hulk, Bruce Banner, injects himself with serum, whereas in some of the comic books that this character is adapted from, the Hulkness comes from a radiation blast.
Which actually comes under another theme that we noticed, which we'll talk about a bit later.
Spoilers! Yeah, the MCU Hulk is very interesting. I think unlike Steve Rogers, morality doesn't play into it as much as intelligence. So the Hulk is known to be, or Bruce Banner is known to be very, very intelligent. He holds 7 different PhDs in this iteration.
Whoa, what? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Our guy is smart.
Our guy is hella smart. Yeah, so I think there too we also have some ideas of consent because he injected himself. So both of those characters, the Hulk and Captain America, turn out to be heroes.
Yes.
Because of what was inside them before they had superhero serum. And then I think the consensual nature of the superhero serum is really important.
The Hulk is an interesting one though because he's a little more complicated.
Yeah, there's
right?
kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing going on where the Hulk is kind of fighting against himself. I think that kind of speaks to the uncertain nature of science sometimes. Injecting yourself, ethical question mark. I don't really think so. But a lot of good real scientific discoveries have happened as a result of that.
From that.
For those of you who are MCU fans, I know you're thinking, hey, wait on a second. There were other people injected with the same superhero serum or a similar one to Captain America. What about Bucky Barnes, also known as the Winter Soldier? And I think this is a really, really interesting one because in a lot of iterations, this is the same serum as Steve Rogers. And, you know, Bucky was Steve's friend. They have very similar moralities, I think. They were both soldiers from America, therefore good people, question mark.
That's so American.
Well, we know that comics came out kind of like after the war and were very focused on that. But Bucky Barnes was injected without consent. And there were like a whole bunch of other things in that as well as, you know, like torture and mind control and some really not good things. But I think the grey areas can kind of be pointed down to him being given this superhero serum without his consent. But he was a good person. So that's where we see like the conflictions. We see him trying to break away from the mind control. We see other people, especially in the MCU, caring for him, trying to get him back.
Yeah, okay. So I am not that familiar with Captain America stories. So is the Winter Soldier one that's you're not sure if like is on the boundaries between a hero and a villain? Like you not
So
sure?
he's introduced as a character as just Bucky Barnes and he's a good guy. Okay. And then we know that there's this Winter Soldier guy who is killing a lot of people and is responsible for a lot of assassination. Steve figures out this is his friend and tries to save him.
Okay.
At that point in time, we know him as a bad character.
Yeah.
We then see there's some confliction between him choosing not to kill Steve, so kind of like recognizing the childhood friend, and kind of eventually getting through
Okay. Yeah.
through that to become
Got you.
a hero ? Yeah, depending on the version and your take. So he kind of has like the full spectrum.
Yeah.
So a grey character overall, but at certain points he is good or bad or I think explicitly grey.
Interesting.
Yeah. So then we come to a villain.
Oh, we're back to Batman and Robin.
Back to Batman and Robin. 1997, Joel Schumacher, hello. Bane in this film, quite different to Bane in The Dark Knight and a lot of the comic adaptations, or a lot of the comics that this was adapted from. This Bane was also injected without consent by the...
by Dr. Woodrow,
Yeah.
who is the lab boss of Poison Ivy.
The lab boss, that was what I was struggling to remember. Yeah, so he was injected without consent by a bad person. So we've got like two bads. This character too, in this iteration of the story, is a formal serial killer and was serving a life sentence in prison.
Even better.
So Dr. Jason Woodrow, lovingly, probably not, gave him a nickname of Bane of Humanity. And this was supposed to be the first of Dr. Woodrow's super soldier program. So we see kind of like that parallel storyline running throughout DC and Marvel. So this Bane, injected without consent, not a good person, becomes super strong, yada, 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 but his intelligence, 0.
Yeah.
Like,
just a
negative
muscle man.
intelligence.
Muscle man. That's it, really.
Yeah, and there was a lot of criticism in this one of how Bane was depicted like, quote, a babbling gorilla.
Facts.
Who just follows orders, whereas his comic book counterpart, who was adapted from, was intelligent and calculating, and actually got in some good fights against Batman. Ironically, apparently this 1997 version of Bane is kind of faithful to his appearance and powers in the comics.
Okay.
Whereas in the Nolan verse, so in the Dark Knight trilogy, Bane is kind of more of a terrorist than a serial killer, and is strong because of extensive training rather than the venom or the super serum.
Yeah. Okay.
But most people like that version better, even though it isn't as true to the comics in a lot of ways. So that's really interesting in this super soldier serum category that we see the full range from hero to miscellaneous ? To villain. And I think it kind of comes down to the way in which they were injected, like with consent and by someone with good or bad morals.
Yeah.
And then the person they were beforehand.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can think of any superheroes who were injected without consent to become heroes. Listeners, let us know if you think of any.
Yeah, I think this is a super interesting one that we said before we could kind of do a whole episode on if we dove into it more. But this, in here we can see science and the technology behind science that is the methodology for it, really heavily contributing to the outcomes of a person. And whether they become like a super good person or a super bad person. And superheroes are kind of exponential version of who you were beforehand. So then from here, category number 3, we have technology creation and usage. So this is another topic that goes across both heroes and villains.
And it's the way that they design and use the technology that's different.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to start this section by talking about villains first. The first example we have is Lex Luthor. Slay.
Bold guy.
Fashionable.
Superman villain.
Lex Luthor creates structures and weapons, etc., out of kryptonite to weaken Superman / Clark Kent.
Yes, he does do that.
It is really interesting because in reality, in our world, not in the comic universe or adaptation universe, there is kind of like a real life equivalent to kryptonite in terms of chemical composition.
Yes, but not green.
Dang.
Or radioactive. And it doesn't glow, unfortunately.
What's the point?
So it's actually a mineral called, bear with me listeners, sodium lithium boron silicate hydroxide. Kryptonite sounds way better.
Yeah.
And is harmless, boring white looking substance, like not really of any note. They actually couldn't call this mineral kryptonite because there is an element called krypton in the periodic table.
And it was too similar of a name.
Yeah.
Damn.
And unfortunately there's no krypton in this mineral, so they couldn't call it that. Just fun facts.
That is a super fun fact. I think Lex Luthor as an example is interesting because he is kind of creating this technology specifically to weaken Superman. Like that is the intention.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't really have any powers himself. It's more he creates technology to combat Superman because he thinks Superman is problematic.
Yeah, and I mean, like, go off if you want, I guess, but maybe stop hurting civilians in the process. Yeah, so I think that's again, we kind of see like this intention setting, like what was the technology meant for. Dropping out of Marvel and DC for a hot second, we're going to talk about Valentine from Kingsman, the comics, and then the films that those comics were adapted into. Directed by Matthew Vaughn, my favorite director. Did he direct X-Men First Class?
Oh, I think he might have.
So crazy. Who would have known such a thing? Me, I care so much. I think Valentine as a villain, is very interesting, and I think the source material does really well positioning him as kind of an understandable villain. And it does this, so this character is kind of like a technology tycoon and computer genius. And he has this speech that I'm gonna read out because I think it's very interesting and fun and important. When you get a virus, you get a fever. That's the human body raising its core temperature to kill the virus. Planet Earth works the same way. Global warming is the fever. Mankind is the virus.
Oof.
We're making our planet sick. A cull is our only hope. If we don't reduce our population ourselves, there's only one of two ways this can go. The host kills the virus, or the virus kills the host.
Whoa.
So, Valentine, eco-minded, a king. We love, slay.
Isn't that kind of like Thanos-esque as well?
Kind of, but in some ways better, in some ways worse. Valentine was like, yeah, all the rich people who are my friends, I'll save them. And everyone else
yeah, sounds about
die.
right. Sounds about right.
Yeah, but it's really interesting that he cares about global warming. And that's apparently his main driver. Because I think a lot of people who watch those films, like the age and demographic it was aimed for, that was a message we resonate with, being like the population or like the generation who've been told climate change is coming, it's your problem, please fix it.
Yeah, this is an interesting example of when a villain has taken a valid concern
and just taken it to the nth degree.
Yeah, to the point where it's their solution to the problem is problematic.
It's just mass murder.
Yeah, yes. That is what it is.
Yeah, so again, I think we see this intention that technology created out of the seed of a good idea, question mark, taken to the nth degree where it becomes villainous. So therefore the entire intent is villainous. Yeah, I thought that was a particularly good example because it isn't within Marvel and DC, but we can see how there's kind of like this perpetuation of tropes in comic books as a whole. We also have another example such as Doc Ock, who is a Spider-Man villain. This scientist created kind of like a chest harness piece of technology that controls 4 like tentacle mechanized arms. And this technology didn't make him bad, but their involvement in a lab accident did.
Interesting. So you've got a bit of a combination here.
Bit of a combination one here. And we'll touch on lab accidents later. In a freak laboratory accident, Doc Ock was bombarded with these explosions of liquids that left him kind of like mentally connected to these mechanical arms. And this accident caused apparently irreversible brain damage, which made this respected science become a megalomaniac criminal.
Nice.
And then fights heroes because that's the best I guess, life path you can come up with, which is very interesting. So this technology wasn't initially created to be villainous, but then it's used villainously.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of puts Doc Ock in a bit of a grey area for this category, and I think that's because it links with one of our later ones. So we can talk about that more in a second.
But let's talk about some heroes who fall under this category.
Okay, yes. So we've got quite a few heroes. We'll start with Tony Stark, Iron Man.
Oh, yeah. He's like prime example of technology, right?
I think this is a great one for this category because Tony Stark's technology is used for weaponry and terrorism without his knowledge.
Yes, very good point.
And I think that's extremely interesting because we can view him as a hero, and I think there's redemption from his technology being used so terribly because he didn't fully register how it was being used. And then when he does, he takes a lot of steps to stop it. Do we criticize the man for not thinking that his weaponry could be used as weapons? Yes. But I think because the intent wasn't there, he's redeemable as a character. We see a lot of technology around Tony Stark, Iron Man. His whole superhero shtick is that he is super smart, super technologically capable, creates the Iron Man suit, has various forms of AI such as Jarvis, Friday, and Boss. And in a lot of adaptations of this character, he is defined in parts by his technology. It both destroys and saves him. And I think he's kind of representative of this category of technology where
he has a more interesting relationship with technology now hearing you talk about this.
Yeah, I think his is complex, and that's really interesting, and it shows how you use the technology can make you either a hero or a villain.
Yeah.
And I think
you're turning on my cybernetics brain right now. I'm like, my brain is going to places that we don't have time to talk about.
Is he a cyborg? Maybe. Yes. Is he post-human? Maybe yes. Man in the machine? Questions there. Yeah, I think there's a lot to say for Tony Stark, Iron Man, and I think particularly in the MCU, there are a lot of people who don't like his character because he grapples with a lot of grey areas, and that complexity, when not fully explored, doesn't satisfy us. So yeah, kind of a grey one, still a hero, I think explicitly, but he does venture between the two sometimes. Some very, very clear heroes though that fall into this category are back to 1997, Joel Schumacher, Batman and Robin, Batman / Bruce Wayne, and then Robin and Batgirl in this series. Yeah, there's lots and lots of visible tech from Batman. He's insanely rich, and a lot of that money goes towards supporting scientific projects that are public.
Batman is sort of the DC counterpart to Iron Man. Is how I view it.
In a lot of ways. So I think it's really interesting that we have this surface level Bruce Wayne scientific support that's very visible. And then we also have the Batman underground. Where did this cool technology come from? You've got all sorts of forms of like the Batmobile, cars, motorbikes, including, and also weaponry. So like the utility belt and the grappling hook gun, etc.
Oh my gosh. Just the images from the movie.
It's so funny. Please watch it if you haven't. I think it's really fun too because Batman as a character is really known for his quote unquote bat tech. It's how he keeps up with his powered allies who might be aliens or have had lab accidents and become superhuman through that. Bruce Wayne becomes superhuman because he chooses to.
Yeah.
His technology is really interesting, and I think he sits firmly as a character in science fiction because of this. So he has space gear. Before drones were a thing, he had a bat drone kind of thing called the Flying Eye.
Oh, that's so true.
And of course we have the classic bat shark repellent, which is a spray to repel sharks. So yeah, lots of sci-fi fantasy imagination. I also wanted to touch on Batgirl, who appears in the Joel Schumacher 1997 version.
She slays. Batgirl slays.
So what is she? A computer scientist who can fix up motorcycles, drive them really well, also fight and use technology really well.
Yeah.
Comic Batgirl in some iterations is Barbara Gordon, so Commissioner Gordon's daughter. She becomes kind of like a woman in the chair and is given the name Oracle.
Oh.
So I think there's some really interesting character through lines there that maybe come up a little bit in Batman and Robin, but are more explored fully in some other areas too. And then I think another firm hero for technology and how they use it is Shuri from Black Panther.
Yes.
So New York Times calls her work technological wizardry. And I think it's very interesting how she can manipulate scenarios, normally like action scenes, with technology, either in person or from the comforts of her lab far away.
Black Panther actually is a fascinating example because it's also an Afrofuturism. And in Afrofuturisms, they like to combine technology with magic. And what they sometimes call it, or techno juju is what they sometimes call it.
Whoa,
and so
that's
that's something that's sort of being explored in the film adaptation too.
Yeah, and I think Shuri as a character is so purely heroic.
Yes.
And this all comes down to her intentions, what she's protecting, the futuristic society she's a part of. And the technology is very much connected to her optimistically, like wholesomely. Like there's nothing about the way she uses technology that is seen as bad ever. Whereas sometimes I think Batman, you know, he's seen as a very dark character. We've spoken about the moral complexities and grey areas of Tony Stark, but I think Shuri is explicitly through and through a good character.
Fascinating that that the female character is like that.
It's so cool. I love it. Yeah, so I guess kind of in summary, technology creation and usage across heroes and villains, it definitely depends on the intent of why you created that technology and then how you use it. And we can kind of see, again, like the full spectrum from creates technology for bad, uses it for bad, to creates technology for interest and then a lab accident happens so you become bad, to technology created for good, used for bad, moral complexities, to technology created for good, used for good. Very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that brings us to our final category.
The one we've teased.
Which is on lab accidents or environmental accidents as molding.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to start with some superhero examples, some really well-known superhero examples. And most famous of all, which everybody's probably thinking about already, Spider-Man.
Oh my God, Spider-Man.
Who is bitten by a radioactive spider in most versions. And in various locations, interestingly, sometimes in science labs as well. Sometimes I think just outdoors.
Sometimes at school. There's so many different iterations of Spider-Man. He kind of has like the full spectrum of possibilities, which is explored in lots of Spider-Man works as well. So it's very, very meta sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Another one that comes to mind is the Flash, who is hit by lightning. Somehow survives. Sometimes at his lab, and sometimes just out in nature.
Yeah, it's interesting, these accidents, because they seem very, very accidental, particularly when they're out in nature and not in a lab.
And another one that also comes to my mind is the Fantastic Four, who were all on an experimental space flight and then they get exposed to cosmic rays. But I think the villains and the lab accidents involved with the villains is a little more interesting.
And by a little, we mean a lot.
So let's come back to Poison Ivy for a minute.
Yes, please.
So in the Batman and Robin movie, she's pushed into vials of her own chemical concoctions by her lab boss, Dr. Woodrow, the problematic guy. In other versions, actually, and the comics, she's injected with poisons and toxins as an experiment by Dr. Woodrow.
Oh, that's an interesting counterpart to superhero serums.
So this attempted murder by Dr. Woodrow backfires completely because she kills him.
No two ways about that one.
Because she somehow survives landing in all those chemicals, and it turns her into this sort of femme fatale character with immunity to natural toxins, a persuasive pheromone dust she acquires, and also a deadly kiss. Like when she kisses you, the poison kills you, basically.
Honestly, that one, such a slay. Iconic. I love. It's amazing.
So she starts out as a good-hearted botanist, but is turned into an eco-terrorist.
Yeah, absolutely. She is.
And after her transformation in the Batman and Robin film, she says, "I am nature's arm, her spirit, her will. Hell, I am Mother Nature, and the time has come for plants to take back the world so rightfully ours, because it's not nice to fool with Mother Nature."
The lines in this film are so iconic.
Yeah,
and I want to learn them all off by heart.
I felt like I had to include that because also I think this is a fascinating portrayal of Mother Nature as a villain.
Yeah.
Which is something that's usually portrayed as good.
She's normally, I think, portrayed very softly, very traditionally feminine, and I think kind of like the femme fatale nature of Poison Ivy when mixed with Mother Nature is a super interesting exploration.
Yeah, for sure. And the character has become nature fighting back, but way to the extreme, to the point where she wants to kill humans and doesn't have the intention of restoring balance and creating harmony between humans and the natural environment.
Very similar to Valentine from Kingsman. Although I think if these two villains were to meet, they would have some fundamental disagreements, which is hilarious because they both are kind of coming from a very similar perspective.
Another Batman Robin character, Mr. Freeze.
He has the best lines in the whole film. Allow me to break the ice.
I was just about to say it, but you beat me to it. So Mr. Freeze, or Dr. Victor Fries, who's a cryogenicist, he is caught in a lab accident while trying to cure his terminally ill wife. And in Batman and Robin, it's an explosion during one of his experiments that causes him to fall into a vat of his own cryofluid that's 50 degrees below zero. Again, he somehow survives that. #science.
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age. His lines, you guys, so good. Ice Age couldn't kill him though.
True. So yeah, survives, but the accident drastically lowers his body temperature to sub-zero levels, so he has to create this cryogenic suit in order to survive.
I would like to point out that Isabel's notes say somehow survives brackets #science.
Yeah, that's what I was saying before.
It's so good.
It's just, a lot of these situations, this would not, you would die.
It would not fly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Mr. Freeze
survives miraculously, and then what does he do?
Turns to crime to find a cure for his wife's illness through any means necessary, even if that means killing everybody and freezing the entire Gotham City.
I think in another version of this character, we'd be like, oh, poor guy. He is so funny in this version, and his backstory
hilarious.
does not really make sense, even though there's kind of a dead wife-ish situation that we kind of feel like a little bit of empathy, but it's just odd. The whole thing is an odd turn.
It's another one, right, where the villain has started with good intentions
and then made it worse.
Yes.
It's like, you're not going to get your intention. Try just a little less hard with a little more goodwill.
And that turns me to another Batman villain who doesn't appear in the Batman and Robin adaptation.
Devastating. But is the most iconic?
The Joker. And the Joker's most common origin story is him falling into a tank of chemical waste, which damages his skin and turns him insane. And the same for Harley Quinn, or Dr. Harleen Quinzel, who is a psychologist at the Arkham Asylum. The Joker pushes her into a chemical plant, the same one he originated from, against her will in some versions.
That's not a healthy relationship.
No. So their whole thing is combined with this sort of a tragic infatuation Harley Quinn has for the Joker and this really abusive, codependent relationship that the Joker uses to manipulate her. There's a lot going on in that. That's like a whole side story between those two characters. Which brings me to this other idea that the Joker, Harley Quinn, and also the Riddler have also these mental health or trauma stories intertwined, which I think is another category that we haven't discussed here, that is seen a lot for villains, especially in the DC universe. And that's exploring these concepts of nature versus nurture. Is it nature that makes the villain, or was it nurture and their upbringing that made the villain? And is this another way of, quote unquote, justifying their crimes and villainy?
Yeah, and I think a lot of these stories explore it really well, particularly when they're more in-depth and part of a series. But I do think oftentimes a lot of the one movie adaptations gloss over it a lot, and we lose the ability to kind of interrogate that more.
And one more villain with that sort of insanity theme is the Green Goblin.
Yes, such an interesting example.
So the first and best known incarnation of the Green Goblin is Norman Osborn, who's head of the science conglomerate Oscorp. And he's exposed to an experimental formula which enhances his physical abilities and intellect, but also drives him to insanity.
Yeah, so devastating. So unlike a lot of the other ones, intelligence goes up, but remains a villain because of the insanity. Very almost like a foil to the Hulk, even though they're in different universes. No, where does Spider-Man sit? Sometimes in the MCU, sometimes in Marvel.
Yeah, no, that's the same universe.
Yeah.
Same universe.
The Sony Disney debates are in my head.
There's so many characters that it's hard to keep track of. We should have marked, I'm just realizing now in our notes, which ones were DC and which ones were Marvel.
We have them color coordinated as to who's a villain and who's a hero.
Yeah. But yeah, there you go.
Super interesting. So I guess you've kind of touched on four categories that we've seen a lot. And then, again, questions of mental health and trauma stories, which for another time, for another deeper dive.
Yeah.
But we see mostly villains coming out of lab accidents and mostly villains coming out of lab accidents. Sometimes heroes coming out of environmental accidents. And there being a little bit of overlap depending on the origin stories of that particular version. We see only villains created out of funding cuts and scientific research rejection. We see a full spectrum of heroes to villains in superhero serum application, mainly on the morals of the person beforehand and whether they were injected with consent. And then we see with technology creation and usage that it comes down to why the tech was created and then why it was used. So I think it's really interesting that there are these main categories, and the way in which the story tropes settle kind of determines if the character can be a hero or can be a villain. I think science and technology in these comics and in these versions of sci-fi genre and speculative fiction genres, science and technology creation and usage is used to signpost where the characters are going.
Absolutely.
And they kind of fall into those categories based on, usage. So science and tech is seen, I think really, our thesis probably is it's integral to character and story building within comics and their adaptations, which is so interesting because I don't think that's something I normally think of. I think heroes and villains, we're kind of like in this fantastical world of what if, super cool, what if, super bad. There's a lot of grounding, I think, from this discussion we've seen in science and tech.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because growing up, I don't remember ever feeling like or thinking that superheroes in comic universes were embedded with science when it's very much the case. Like you said, I thought it was more fantastical, and when actually a lot of the time they've given a maybe questionable scientific explanation for how these characters came about and why they're behaving in certain ways.
Yeah, and I think maybe some of that comes down to where the big boom of Western comics came from, which was post-war, and war horrible and political and, really driven by those factors, but sometimes determined by the uses of science and technology by the different sides. And I think as I get older and the more that I actually am reading in our workplace about the origin of cybernetics, I'm realizing how entwined technology and science were in fighting wars.
Completely.
And I think, that is the era of like the golden age and the big boom of these comics and the characters and where they came from. So with that, I think we can head to our individual sections, which are very, very both closely related to this topic, which I think it continues to be a nice way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
So Isabel, what do you have for us?
Yeah. So I would like to talk about another kind of subtext in comics, particularly American comics, because the wonderful and joyous thing about pop culture, including comic books, is it can be analyzed and dissected from so many different angles and so many different
100%.
Important angles as well. Science is just one of the wonderful ways. So I actually read a recent article in The Conversation talking about American comic book history and its intersection with Jewish culture, something I had no idea about until I read this article, but sort of touches on the things you were saying about post-war and the boom of comics post-war. So Jewish creators are actually a fundamental part of the American comic industry. So we've got Stan Lee of Marvel and Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know about those two.
Yeah, so those two were sons of Jewish European immigrants in America in the 1930s. And some modern comic book writers actually compare Superman's alien immigrant identity to experiences of other immigrants in America. And some also highlight the importance of the Superman character for combating the anti-Semitic era of the 1930s, describing the character as an ultimate example of an immigrant who makes their new home better.
That's genuinely so nice to hear.
Yeah, I think it's lovely. And there's also some elements, apparently, of Jewish mythology in the character. There's also a bit of a belief that the creators Siegel and Schuster also were inspired by a famous Polish bodybuilder called the Jewish Superman, who actually toured America in the 1920s. So I think there's a definite
link there.
Yeah, definitely. Batman was also created by Jewish writers and children of immigrants. And though Batman himself doesn't have any obvious Jewish characteristics, his cousin Batwoman was later depicted as a Jewish woman, and it becomes a defining part of her character, which I think is fascinating too.
Yeah, I think that's really cool that it can become a foundational part of the character. And I think kind of at the start, maybe there was this separation of, Superman could have been read as Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that later we have explicit representation kind of completing this full circle.
Mm-hmm. And comics are a very powerful way of making different cultures visible as well. Another Batman character, actually a villain who we didn't talk about earlier, is Clayface, who might actually be derived from Jewish golem folklore.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Which is this idea of
it's like a clay creature who can be controlled by someone and enacts their will, right? That's the golem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's another example of Jewish folklore and mythology being intertwined with comics.
Whoa. That was really nice.
Yeah. Do you wanna talk about the thing that you love talking about, Ella?
Boy, howdy do I ever. So we didn't really talk about a lot of X-Men examples in here. And I think that's because it's very interesting that in X-Men, kind of like the hero X-Men and the villain X-Men, they're all kind of the same thing. Like they were all born with this genetic abnormality. So that kind of puts them on an equal playing field more broadly. Specifically, I wanted to chat at the end of this episode, actually not just going to X-Men broadly, but more into X-Men First Class, the best X-Men film. In my humble opinion. And I want to talk about Hank McCoy, who is a scientist who has mutant abilities, and therefore this genetic abnormality. And I want to talk about his moral grayness in this film, because he tries to reduce his power / mutant ability and become what he isn't. And he tries to do this through corralling a young woman, Raven, to give him her blood samples so he can work out her powers, which is to transfigure her appearance into someone else. And he wants to use that to visibly turn himself back into the human he thought he was and not visibly look like a mutant. It's a really great area because we recognize that these mutants face discrimination because of how they look visibly different. But also, it's kind of really depressing when he doesn't want to be himself. And this is actually who he is. It's part of his genetic code. It's what makes him him. And he's trying to convince others, such as Raven, to think that too. It's interesting because Hank McCoy, the Beast, is a hero. And Eric Lensher / Magneto, who in this film is a hero becoming villainous, he's got them moral ambiguities. He's a bit of a grey character. He is the one who teaches Raven to be, quote, mutant and proud. To be proud of herself as she is, that she doesn't need to look a certain way. I think that's very powerful in terms of body image, but also in terms of acceptance. And it's very anti-discrimination, which I think is what X-Men's all about.
Yeah.
And because Hank is opposing this view that we know is right, like we know loving yourself is right, his lack of pride and trying to use science to fix fate, question mark, I think it backfires on him because of a warning about tempting fate and not being true to yourself. So what happens in this film, a little bit of a spoiler, Hank McCoy injects himself with the serum he's derived from Raven's blood. He offers it to her too, and she turns it down because she says, no, wait, be proud of who you are with me. And he says, absolutely not, injects himself. And then instead of having really abnormal feet, becomes covered in blue fur. So he looks a lot more visually different. Kind of as almost like a fable and moral story.
Yeah. Wow, a lot going on there.
A lot going on there. It doesn't quite fit within the superhero serum category we talked out, kind of adjacent to it. And it's really interesting. I think X-Men First Class I love because the characterization feels like it's been given the space to explore these grey areas and not just cast someone as straight hero or straight villain, which I think is why I didn't want to put any X-Men characters into the discussion we had today, is because there's so much ambiguity, and that's what makes it interesting, especially from X-Men First Class.
Yeah, well, it meant you could talk about it in this part of the podcast. So.
Yeah, so I still win. And there you have it. More thoughts to think. And if those thoughts aren't enough for your thoughts, we have some questions for you.
Yeah, we do. So I would love to know, listeners, what science narratives in superhero comic universes have you seen? Are they to do with the origin story of the heroes and villains, or are they to do with something else? Like, are they an entire plot line? I'm especially interested to know if you know of any science narratives in non-Western comic universes, because we've talked about Western comic universes in this episode.
A lot. Yeah. And also, even if they are Western, anything outside of Marvel or DC, because we focused a lot on those today. If you do want to let us know, hit up us on our socials at SCI_burst, BURST, on all your favorite platforms. And you can also email us on our Gmail, which is cyburstpodcast@gmail.com. All lowercase, no underscores. cyburstpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay nerdy.
Stay nerdy, friends.
And we'll see you next time
for our last episode of the season. Get excited.
Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.